Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first episode of the Extended Bench for 2024. I hope you've had a very good Christmas and New Year's break, and I'm ready to get back into it here at the Extended Bench. Kicking off the year, we've got a look at the history of the football. So, judging by the photo that is up on your screen now, I guess you know what this is. And it's the Steeden match replica, or Steeden Symmetry match replica, which was the official match ball of the 2023 NRL season. But it's taken a long time and a lot of development to get to the ball that we see being used today, not just in the NRL, but in the NRLW, at State of Origin, and international level, as well as over there in England in the Super League. Steeden isn't sponsoring this video, but hey, Steeden, my DMs are open, so if you want to, you can slide in there. And the balls that we see that are used today are fairly recent inventions. You only go back to the 1990s when the rubber compound mix, which is the type of ball that we use today, that's when it was really introduced to the NRL, or previous to that, the ARL. Prior to that, we had a leather ball, which was what was used for the vast majority of not only rugby league, but rugby union, soccer, and American football. Now, of course, rugby footballs date back to the 19th century, the early 1800s, because, of course, before rugby football was invented, we had association football that we commonly call soccer or football, depending on where in the world you're from. And those balls were consisting of an interior tube, which was often a pig's bladder, encased in leather. So things have come a long way from blowing up pig's bladders to now blowing up rubber footballs. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, the ball is older than the sport of rugby union or rugby league. Balls began to be manufactured in 1823 by Gilbert and Linden, and they were manufacturing them for the rugby school in England. The development of rugby outside of association football is what led to the development of the more egg-shaped ball we see today. Quite clearly, it's very hard to kick an egg-shaped ball along the ground and have a predictable roll path, whereas the round ball is perfect for soccer or football. Those egg-shaped balls are a lot easier to catch, a lot easier to handle, and kick out of the hands, although we have seen some developments as the sports of rugby union and rugby league split further towards the end of the 1800s. But of course, the ball wasn't always the egg-shaped one that we see today. Of course, it had that kind of rounder shape that was being used by association football in the early 1800s. And because they were mostly made of pig's bladders and old leather, well, they weren't exactly round either. They were more of a plum shape because the ball would take on the shape of the pig's bladder being used as the inner tube that was inflated. As I've already mentioned his name, you likely know the name of William Gilbert, and his name is still emblazoned across the majority of rugby union balls used at professional and international level. And he began manufacturing balls in 1823 before a competitor in Robert Linden came along in the 1850s. They were both leather workers, so they had access to the tools and materials required to put together the balls. And the interesting thing here is they actually started with 7 leather panels as opposed to the 4 panels that we see today. And they didn't stitch them on the inside, they actually had to connect all the panels using quite a large fat button at the end of the ball, which apparently was then called a puntabout football. It was very easy to kick that kind of flattish surface at the bottom of the ball where the button brought together all the leather panels. And that interior pig's bladder, well, guess what? There were no air inflation tools back then. There were no hand pumps, there were no air compressors. You had to inflate the ball by mouth. So guess what? You were blowing air into a dead pig's bladder. And that came with all of the health concerns you can think of. Now, Lyndon's wife, Rebecca, she was the chief air inflator for his shop. And unfortunately, due to all the diseases that she was coming in contact with due to the pig's bladders, she died due to complications of those very same diseases. So it wasn't even a particularly safe area to get involved in. Now, of course, using animal materials for a recreational sport isn't going to lend it to spreading very far. People are a little bit squeamish, and not only that, you are very much constrained by the supply of pig's bladders that can be used in the balls. Now, of course, pig's bladders that had large holes in them or that were, severely damaged during the butchering process, you weren't going to be using them to inflate because they couldn't inflate. Then in the 1840s, vulcanized rubber hit the scene and they replaced the internal pig's bladder. So you now had an inner tube of rubber still encased in an outer casing of leather. The use of these rubber inner tubes were quickly adopted by both Linden and Gilbert, and of course they were more hygienic, they were more pliable, and they were easier to work with. The only drawback was, because they were a little bit more pliable and they were a little bit harder to blow up, so you couldn't use your lung pressure anymore to inflate the ball. I mean, think about the balls we have now. You cannot blow those balls up with your lungs. So Robert Linden invented the pump. The brass hand pump, which was quite large compared to the small hand pumps that we have today and the bike pumps that we use today, that was used to inflate the balls after Linden saw an ear syringe. And luckily for us and for the sporting world, Linden didn't patent any of his inventions, so the spread of pumps and footballs was easy to occur because no one was having to pay for his patent license. And it was during this period we also saw the shrinking down from the number of leather panels from 7 to 4. And that gives us the basics of the ball that we know today and was used throughout most of the 20th century. 4 leather panels encasing a rubber inner tube. So it's quite amazing to think that since the 1800s, the basic design of the ball hasn't changed all that much. And sure, the materials have changed and there has been a much clearer split between rugby union and rugby league balls, but the basics are still very similar to what they were when Linden and Gilbert were manufacturing the balls all those years ago. And as I mentioned, they used to have a big button at one end to connect all the panels. Well, this was gone. Linden had worked out to stitch an interior way, removing the button and ensuring that they had a much more pronounced egg shape, and there was no longer this flat portion of the ball where you would kick the button. By now we're reaching the late 1800s, and in 1895 we have the Great Schism, which separates rugby league and rugby union. And there was no great difference initially between the balls that were used. They were an egg-shaped ball, they were made of leather with a rubber inner tube. No real difference there. It's only as the two sports pulled further and further apart that we had more specific balls for the two different codes. Over time, the rugby league balls became a lot more pointed, which was easier to catch and pass and throw across the field, whereas rugby union balls maintained a little bit more of that flatter edge towards the tips of the ball, which was obviously used due to the button that was originally there. And that was due to the amount of kicking that was undertaken in rugby union and is still undertaken today. So if you pick up a rugby union ball, it's a little easier to kick downfield, whereas it tends to float more when it's passed across a distance, as opposed to a rugby league ball, which tends to cut through the air when there's a nice big cutout pass thrown. So let's fast forward about 50 years and we arrive with Ray and Eric Steeden setting up their own manufacturing works in Manly on the Sydney North Shore in New South Wales, Australia. They're producing kind of everything from league and union, even cricket balls. And within 15 years, they had become the official ball supplier to the New South Wales Rugby League. And that's where we see the famous Steeden logo on the ball with the New South Wales Rugby League logo. And Steeden have remained with the New South Wales Rugby League, the ARL and the NRL ever since. And it's under Steeden that we see some of the more modern developments occur, and the biggest developments ever since Linden and Gilbert had to remove those extra panels and remove the button from the outside of the ball. In 1992, Steeden and the New South Wales Rugby League switched from those old leather balls that would get waterlogged and very heavy to a new rubber compound mix, which wouldn't attract water when it was wet and was much easier to handle and pass. But there was one historical element still remaining in the 1990s, and that's those 6 leather stitches down the middle of the ball. At this stage, they were very much just for an aesthetic purpose. They weren't really holding the ball together. Much of the work was being done internally, and it was simply because they were there. Well, in 1998, with the formation of the NRL and the end of the Super League War, it was also a time for change for the ball. Those external stitches went, and we have the ball that we know today. It reduced weight, it reduced drag, and the ball became a lot more uniform in terms of passing and kicking and bouncing. There's no difference now whether the ball bounces on its belly or on its point. Every part of the ball is the same. We've also seen developments in grip technology. So of course you see the players out there with their sticky spray, and some of them have got some kind of creams or things on the front of their jerseys, or they've got little rubber tabs on their jerseys to keep hold of the ball. But the ball in and of itself is actually quite grippy. The rubber compound mix means that rubber is almost chalk-like. It almost dries the hands when they catch it. Even in incredibly wet weather, we don't see a lot of loose balls, and really the bigger issue is those players that get incredibly sweaty, or maybe they're playing up in Townsville when it's warm, or in Brisbane at the start of the season. But in terms of the actual grip, the balls are about as good as you could get in the modern era. They've got those little raised dimples, which, while they don't exactly make the ball easier to grip, they provide a way for the water to run off the ball without getting into too much contact with the hands or the forearms. On the flip side though, the more rubber that's in the ball, the faster that ball can break down. Interestingly, the NRL ball is swapped out every 2 to 3 matches, with those ones going to training and the new ones being rolled out. Whereas those balls that you can pick up for about 50 or 60 bucks in Rebel, they've got a higher synthetic mix, which means their grippiness or your ability to catch the ball goes down slightly, but they're a lot more durable. So if you're looking for a ball to use for an entire year, that one will do. Whereas those actual match balls, well, they're going to kind of degrade fairly quickly. And today, it's not just the match balls or those match replicas that are available. There are all different types of balls that you can use, whether it's beach footballs or there are weighted training balls. There are different types of bouncing balls. There are balls that have a completely flat edge that you can actually throw into a wall and have them bounce back. We've come a long way since people were blowing up pigs' bladders in the 1800s to now having these rubber compound balls that allow players to hold them in one hand and throw them around regardless of how wet or dry the conditions are. If you liked that episode, don't forget to subscribe to the channel or hit like on the video. It really helps a lot. If you're also interested in some more history of rugby league, I do have a history playlist on the channel, so you can go there and find out how rugby league started and some of the events that have kind of shaped the game that we know today. 2024 is looking to shape up as a big year for the extended bench. So until next time, bye for now.